and good morning. All right, we're going to do our reading lesson today. And I'm just going to start out by saying it's poetry. You might enjoy poetry, but generally boys do not like poetry. But I have a sneaking suspicion that if you have to like poetry, what we're going to talk about today will end up being your favorite. I like poetry, and this actually happens to be my favorite because to me it's the easiest, and that's what we're going to learn today. It's called a haiku. You ever heard of a haiku? Well, that's what we're going to learn today. All right, so before we read what's on the screen, don't worry about that. Let's look in your reader book on page 168. Oh, it's so long to read. Oh my goodness, it's going to take us all day to read this. I'm just kidding. It's a tiny little poem. It's called Cherry Time. Now I'm going to read this poem, and as I read it, I want you to think about what it is the author's looking at. Burdened cherry limbs, battleground of man and bird, bucket against beak. Sounds like he's looking at some cherries in the garden on the vine, and he's trying to pick them. And there's birds that want to eat these cherries, and so there's a battle going on. Now, this poem, like I said, is called a haiku. It's a Japanese style poem. It never has rhyme. That's one of the reasons it's generally the most favorite of all people, especially people who don't really like poetry. Because some people can write a lot of good poetry and some people have a hard time with it. And that's okay. I usually can write poetry pretty well, and I like poetry. But it seems to me that the boys in my family just don't care anything about rhyming, and that's why they like haikus, because you do not have to rhyme. Now, there is a certain flow to a haiku, and it's very simple. All you have to remember is 5-7-5. Remember claps where we've clapped the syllables? That's what we do. So let's clap this first line in Cherry Time. It needs to be 5 syllables. Are you ready? Here we go. Burdened cherry limbs. Okay, now you count, okay, as I clap. Here we go. Burdened cherry limbs. Was that 5? All right. The next line, the second line, needs to be 7. All right, here we go. Battleground of man and bird. Was that 7? And the last line should be 5. Here we go. Bucket against beak. That was 5. 5-7-5. That's all you got to remember. Now, 2 other things about a haiku. Usually, a haiku is about something in nature. It could be animals, it could be plants, it could be both. A lot of times, not every time, but a lot of times the haiku poem will have some kind of competition in it. Like this one had a competition between the man wanting to pick the cherries and the birds. So it doesn't always have to have competition, but oftentimes it does. And it's about nature. And it has to be 5-7-5. Doesn't have to rhyme. Now, there's one more thing I wanted to show you. What, in that haiku, what letter is repeated a lot? Burdened cherry limbs, battleground of man and bird, bucket against beak. You hear a lot of bees in there, don't you? Okay, and the bees are at the beginning of the words. Okay, when you have a repeated consonant sound, that's called alliteration. Long word. Alliteration. So you have a lot of sounds at the beginning of words. It doesn't always have to be a consonant. It can be a vowel too, but it's always at the beginning of a word. So oftentimes it is a consonant. But that's called alliteration. Now, a haiku doesn't have to have alliteration, but it does kind of make it a little bit more interesting. So let's look at this on the screen. Now this is called Maine Moose. The Maine Moose managed to give 2 muffled bellows. The odd marksman missed. That is supposed to be, okay. The odd marksman missed. Now, notice, let's count these. The main moose managed. That's 5. To give 2 muffled bellows. That's 7. The odd marksman missed. That's 5. So it has to have 5, 7, 5. And when I say that, I mean syllables. Okay, all together, 5, 7, 5. Did you notice the alliteration in the poem? It's M's, main moose managed, muffled, marksman missed. Okay, doesn't mean every letter has to start with it, but several of them would start with it. Now, you can imagine what your assignment is going to be, and that is to come up with your own haiku. Okay, so it can be about anything you want it to be about. But to stay true to a haiku, try your best to keep it to something in nature. It could be the weather. It could be the seasons. It could be the sky. It could be the ground. It could be a bug. It could be some sort of animal or a fish or anything you want it to be about. Trees. It could be about leaves. Anything in nature. Try your best to use some alliteration in it where you use the same sound several times. And also remember, it's really good to have like 2 things kind of fighting against it. Not really fighting, but 2 things in it if you can. Now you can write several of them if you'd like to. They're usually easy to write. The main thing you got to remember is 5, 7, 5. Okay? If you need any help, let me know. And I'm not going to grade your poem, but I do want to see it. I love haikus. All right? That is all your lesson for the day.